Here's a slightly more complex example. Since you've already practiced this, you should be able to help me go through this very quickly. We're going to run through this code exactly the same as we did before. We're going to compile it first, and then we're going to execute it. All right. How do we start? How's the compiler going to start? Which scope are we talking to on line 1?
Global.
Hey, global scope. I have a formal declaration for foo on line 1. Ever heard of him? The answer is?
No.
Nope, but now I've created that red marble and put it in the red bucket. Thanks very much. What do we do next?
Line 3. Bar.
Hey, global scope. I have an identifier called bar. Ever heard of him? The answer is?
No.
No.
Nope, but now I've got another red marble in the red bucket called bar. By the way, that marble happens to point at a function. So let's step into that function. What's next?
Hey, do you know
RC scope of
What scope are we talking to?
bar?
Hey, scope of bar, we have a formal declaration for foo. Ever heard of him? The answer is?
No.
Nope.
No, because this is a different bucket now. We're not asking about the var foo in the red bucket. We're now talking to the blue bucket. So, hey, scope of bar, I've got a variable called foo. Ever heard of him? The answer is no. But now I have a blue marble. What's next?
Baz.
Hey, scope of
Bar.
bar, I have a identifier called Baz. Ever heard of him? The answer is?
Nope.
Nope. But now we have another blue marble in the bucket. Baz is in the blue bucket along with foo, right? Oh, by the way, Baz is pointing at a function. Let's go inside of Baz and make another bucket. This is like the green bucket. Okay, so now we've made a green bucket for the scope of Baz. How do we proceed?
A scope of Baz.
What line are we on?
6.
6.
Hey, scope of Baz, I have a formal declaration for a parameter called foo. Ever heard of him? The answer is?
No.
Nope. But now we've made a green marble, the parameter foo. Okay? We keep going. Anything to do with line 7? What about line 8?
Nope.
No.
So now we step back out. Now we're on line 10. Anything to do with line 10?
No.
Other than storing metadata, which we'll come back to at runtime. There's no formal declarations on those. We come back out to the global scope, starting with line 13. Any more formal declarations there?
No.
So are we done with compilation? Okay, great. Now it's time to execute. Remember, all the variable declarations and function declarations have been compiled away. Where does execution start?
Line 1.
Line 1. How does line 1 execute?
Hey, global scope. Do you
Hey,
have
global scope, I have a
And I have
left-hand reference for
full.
foo. Ever heard of him? The answer is?
Yes.
Sure. So now I've been given that red marble back. I go to the right-hand side. I look at the quote bar. I have that value. I make the assignment. Line 1 is complete. Lines 3 through 11 have been compiled away, so execution moves to line 13. How does line 13 itself execute?
Goes back into bar.
You got to tell me, how does line 13 itself execute? Same process that
Hey,
we've been doing all
global
along.
scope, do you know
Hey, global scope, I have a what kind of reference?
bar?
left.
Right.
Right-hand side.
So some of you say left and some of you say right.
Right.
A left-hand reference is otherwise known as a target reference, right? So that would have to be the target of an assignment. Is it a target of assignment? So if it's not a left-hand reference, it must be a right-hand reference. Kind of like with the falsy truthy thing. It's truthy because it's not on the falsy list. It's a right-hand value because it's not a left-hand value. Because it's not receiving the target. It's not the target of an assignment. Okay? So that's an RHS. That's a right-hand side value for an identifier called bar. First time we've seen that in our example so far. Okay? So we're going to say, hey, global scope, I have an RHS reference for bar. Ever heard of it? And the answer is?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So we go and get that marble out. That's a red marble, right? Now, we need to know what is in the value of bar. Since we're using it as a right hand, we need also the value. So we go look for the value. What is currently in bar?
Function?
A function. Okay? There's currently a function in bar. That's great. So we go get that function, and then we come to these parentheses here on line 13, and we execute it. So your instinct is to think of line 13 as a single statement, but it's actually two very separate and important operations. The first one, go resolve the bar expression to find out what value it is. The second thing is to do that parenthesis execute. Parentheses aren't technically an operator, but in this case, they're sort of working like an operator. They're executing the function. Okay? Make sense? All right, so now that we've executed bar, where does execution move to?
Four.
Line 4. How does that go?
Bar,
Scope manager.
Hey, scope of bar. I have a
LHS.
LHS for foo. Ever heard of him? The answer is?
Yes.
Yep, because you compiled him just a few microseconds ago. Excellent. So we find that blue marble now. And then we go to the right-hand side. We find, quote, Baz. We make the assignment. Line 4 is complete. 6 through 9 have been compiled away. Execution moves to line 10. How does line 10 execute?
Scope of bar.
Hey, scope of bar. I have a
RHS.
RHS for
Baz.
Baz. Ever heard of him? The answer is
Yes.
Yes.
yes, because you formally declared him. Now, what is the value in Baz? A function. So then we go to the parentheses on line 10 and execute it. Execution then moves to line 7. How does line 7 execute?
A function Baz.
Hey, scope of Baz. I have a
I have a identifier called foo.
a left-hand side reference for foo.
Left hand side of a foo.
Ever heard of him?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
because you declared him on what line?
6.
Line 6, the parameter. Okay? So now we have the green marble. We can assign BAM into foo, and we're done with line 7. How does line 8 execute? Hey, scope of Baz. I have a LHS for BAM. Ever heard of him? The answer is go fish. Right? So where do we go next?
So bar.
We go to scope of bar. Hey, scope of bar. I have a LHS for BAM. Ever heard of him? The answer is
No.
go fish. Where do we go next? Hey, global scope. I have a LHS for. Ever heard of him?
But I will create it for you.
No, but I went ahead and created one for you anyway. Aren't I so helpful? Ah! So now we go to the right-hand side. We find this yay value. We assign it into the global variable BAM as opposed to a local variable. Okay? Execution finishes with line 8. That takes us back to 10. That finishes back to line 13. How does line 14 execute?
A global scope.
Hey, global scope. I have
I
a
have a
RHS for who? Ever heard of him? The answer is
Yes.
yes. We go and get his value, and it is? I heard multiple answers. Who thinks it's something other than bar? Okay? It's going to be bar. Why is it not Baz or BAM? Those are different marbles. Even though they have the same name, we found those in different buckets. Remember how that lookup was essentially first come, first serve. We asked the very first scope that we could find. So when we were on line 4, we didn't care about the marble in the bucket on line 1 because we already had a matching one. It's first come, first serve in terms of that lookup. Okay? So foo has the value, quote, bar. Okay? What about line 15? How does it execute? Hey, global scope, we have RHS for BAM. Ever heard of him? The answer is?
Yes.
Well, now we have. Had line 15 been on line 12, we wouldn't have heard of him, right? But because it's happened after bar was called, we now have a BAM. We go ask for the value of BAM, and what is it? Yeah, no. You have to say it in the most ironic tone possible. Yay. The value of BAM is yay. Because this is a terrible thing to have a global variable with that value in it, right? All right, line 16. How does line 16 execute? A global scope. I have a RHS for BAS. Ever heard of him? The answer is
No.
Ooh. Have we heard of BAS in the global scope?
No.
What scope? What bucket was this one in?
Bar.
It was in the blue bucket, right? So when we're asking only the global bucket, only the red bucket, we've never heard of a BAS. So what do you think? Do you think it's going to go ahead and just create one for us?
Oh, nice.
It's going to throw exceptions.
So it's going to throw a reference error. So this is a difference between LHS and RHS, which is the whole reason why I had you understand the difference between the two. Because unfulfilled LHS references like line 8 created an implicit global. Unfulfilled RHS references like line 16 always create a reference error. Okay? In a sense, once you learn strict mode, you don't have to pay any attention because they both create reference errors. But when you're not in strict mode, the difference depends on what context it was in. Make sense? Just one final time to reiterate here. An unfulfilled LHS reference. That is a variable that is referenced on the left-hand side as the target of an assignment, but has never been formally declared anywhere. An unfulfilled LHS reference in non-strict mode results in an implicit global variable. An unfulfilled RHS reference, that is a reference, a variable in the right-hand side position, the source value position, that has never been formally declared in any scope that we have access to. An unfulfilled RHS reference always results in a reference error. Reference error, BAS, is not defined. And the difference between undefined and undeclared is what?
Undefined is declared but doesn't have a value.
And
Not defined is not.
undeclared is never formally declared in any scope we have access to. Let me say that one last time. Undefined, definitely been declared, just at the moment has no value. And by the way, a lot of people like to think, well, it doesn't have a value yet. That's what they'll say. It doesn't have a value yet. Like if you just say var foo semicolon, right? Well, it turns out a variable can have a value, and then you can take the value away. You can assign the undefined value to a variable, which has the effect of getting rid of any other value that it had. So the most appropriate thing is an undefined variable is a variable that does not currently have any other value. That's the way to say it. A variable that does not currently have any other variable, any other value. I like to think of this lexical scope like this. This is the metaphor, and this is how we'll wrap for now. We like to think of this as sort of like a lookup process, kind of like if you were looking for somebody's office in a building. And you said, hey, I need you to come to my office and just find me. So you'd start in the first floor, and you'd say, do I have that office on this floor? The first floor represents the current scope. If you don't find it, you go up one level. And then you go up, and you go up, and you go up, and you either find it at some point, or you get to the very top of the building, the top floor, and you either find it or not, but there's nowhere else to go. So it helps me to think of it as the elevators or stairs in a building. Think about that process, okay? So that's nested lexical scopes. We're going to take our break here for today. We're going to meet back tomorrow morning, sharp at 9:30, and we'll pick up continuing with lexical scopes. Thanks, and have a great night.